wasn't it nice? Last Thursday. And then everyone took the day off on Friday. We had a 4-day weekend. Thank you for the sacrifice that was made all those years ago by those soldiers in Gallipoli so that we could have a 4-day weekend. I think we possibly have lost the reason for Anzac Day. And hey, not pointing any fingers, I didn't get up and go to a dawn service either. But what does Anzac Day mean for us as a nation all these years later? Is it just some time off and perhaps some of those yummy porridge biscuits? Joining us on the program now, part of the research team at Maxim Institute, Thomas Scrimgeour. Thomas, kia ora. Thanks for your time today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Andrew. Good to see you.
So Anzac Day for you, what did that look like? Are you a dawn service Anzac biscuits kind of guy?
Well, I confess I'm a few years into a move to Auckland, and I haven't been an Anzac service guy since then. Growing up in Hamilton, I went to them. I knew where they were. I knew where the parking was. And for me, I'm perhaps one of these New Zealanders who engages, but not all the time. And so I found a hurdle, and I didn't attend a dawn service this year.
Sorry to call you out on that one. And hey, if you're going to the dawn service War Memorial Museum in Auckland, you have to arrive about 4 hours early so that you can park in South Auckland and walk the rest of the way. It's part of the routine, you know. However, when it comes to Anzac Day, it's a bit of a funny one, isn't it? The way in which it's commemorated, and you know, we see these wonderful programs on Māori TV and others as well that tell part of our story. But in terms of a holiday, what are we celebrating? What are we commemorating, if we are at all? It's a bit of an odd one out, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the things I've been reflecting on is that it's just quite a different tone to all the rest of our public holidays. You know, Easter is sort of the last trip to the beach before winter. You got to get in there. Christmas and New Year's are kind of in the national consciousness, just times to get together with family and eat some nice food and celebrate. Whereas Anzac Day has this different tone. It's a lot more solemn, it's reflective, and in part because obviously the Gallipoli campaign, which is sort of what we're first and foremost thinking about, was such a disaster of a campaign. So we can't get all excited about what great conquering heroes we are because we're remembering a tragic defeat. And it's hard to kind of sell products for Anzac Day. It would be a little bit in bad taste. So it's not really commercialized in the way that some others are.
Poppies and biscuits will only get you so far in that regard. It is in some ways, though, the closest that we get to a national church service than any of our other holidays, even the so-called religious ones like Christmas and Easter. There's perhaps more prayers said, more hymns sung on Anzac Day by people who have no faith connection than the rest of the year combined.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I thought it was notable at Gallipoli this year, Winston Peters, who is the Deputy Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, he gave a speech and he quoted heavily from Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And so he kind of speaks quite directly, yet we cannot hallow these grounds. The men who died here have already made sacred the ground upon which we come every 25th of April. Like this language of the sacred really shows up quite explicitly, even in really kind of secular contexts on Anzac Day, which is out of tone with the rest of the national calendar.
It is in some ways a national church service, but and also the state funeral for the unknown soldier. And for most New Zealand families, particularly if their family history goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, there is a grandfather, a great-great-grandfather, an uncle, somebody in their family tree who's no longer there because of the First World War and subsequent conflicts. For you, Thomas, is that part of your family story?
Yeah, I think on both sides of my family have been in New Zealand back to the war eras, and there's kind of a range of stories. There were family members who went off to war, but there's also a strain of conscientious objectors in my family from kind of Christian convictions.
Yep.
The story that I've been reflecting on the most recently is of my great-grandfather. So my grandfather is still alive, and so his father, Thomas Scrimgeour, was a conscientious objector. Mm-hmm. He was part of the Brethren Church, and he felt that that the scriptures told him he could not go and fight in a war. Yep. And so he was conscripted to go fight, and he appealed that conscription, went to a military tribunal. And this year I was reading, it was the first time I'd actually seen, I knew he had objected and then had been sent off to war, but I hadn't realized that there was digitized a news article about that tribunal hearing.
Wow.
And the headline for that tribunal hearing, appellant's unreasoning beliefs. So it was not a flattering piece of coverage. But because he was part of the Brethren Church, Brethren didn't have any kind of formal written doctrine, very informal, very low church. And so his appeal was rejected. They were like, you don't have any written doctrine as a group saying you can't go fight to war.
Yep.
You're just being a bit unreasonable. And so he did go to the war as a medical orderly. He served at Passchendaele, where he inhaled some mustard gas and contracted tuberculosis, but recovered and came home and lived into his 80s. So I think like one of these emotionally complex stories of Anzac Day, sort of a man who was unwilling to go, but then went and bore some of the consequences of that, but did not pay the ultimate price. And that ambiguity, I think, captures what's quite interesting about Anzac Day is that serious emotions, serious issues, which we don't get a lot of elsewhere.
And interesting, even back in 1915 or whenever that was, that the courts of the day, certainly the journalists of the day, considered Christianity to be an unreasonable belief, although I appreciate that there were people motivated by faith to go to war as well as to object to going to war. So, as you say, a complex issue. One of the other questions that we ask in this Anzac season, and I think this may be behind the resurgence of young people attending Anzac Day services, is to ask the question, what would we do? If this was happening in our country now, a very different nation, of course, than we were back over 200 years ago, but would we go? Would we object? What stand would we take? And would we make the same levels of selfless sacrifice that so many people did literally at the drop of the hat all those years ago? Very much a different nation now, Thomas.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's some interesting stuff been written recently about the way we've changed how we talk about the Anzacs. These days, often our coverage is of victims who were caught up in a larger story who go off and make a pointless sacrifice. And so the tragic is really foregrounded. But actually, it's important to remember that there were a large number of people who, for better or worse, whatever we think about the decision they made a conscious decision that their nation was something for which they were willing to die.
Yeah.
And so it forces us, I think, to do some introspection as well. What is our nation? What is it about New Zealand that we love, or what is it about New Zealand we ought to love? And what is it worth to us to preserve? Because I don't think that's a straightforward question. I'm not here as someone who is confident in those answers. I think this Anzac Day gave me an occasion to reflect on that uncertainty. What is it about our nation that is worth protecting? And what is it about our nation that might cost something to protect? And how would we go about that? So, I think Anzac Day raises those questions about national identity and then also national service, which is very compelling.
I mean, certainly compelling indeed. And of course, since the First World War, we've seen other wars, other responses from the community. If we look at news headlines at the moment, though, Thomas, it seems that we're fighting each other and don't have that unity that would be required. Although that's a little bit chicken and egg. Sometimes if we have this external existential threat to our nationhood, whatever that means, that brings the unity that perhaps is lacking in society. I'm not saying we should have another war, but maybe that is the missing component that was there then that isn't there now.
Yeah, and picking up on that word unity, I think something I've been reflecting on is what a double-edged sword or a mixed blessing unity is. It's easy for us to talk about sort of a lack of trust and we're not as united and we fight more than we used to. But thinking back to the story of Thomas Scrimgeour, the nation was very united at the time, and that unity required that he be sent off to war against his religious convictions. Yeah. That because of national unity, because of this greater cause, that individual conscience could not be respected. And so we want to be a little bit like unity is not the be-all and end-all. But I think you're right. We fight ourselves a lot in this country. We argue. But that external threats and bigger challenges do often call us to be united. We think of the early days of COVID, the country came together with a lot of consensus that kind of eroded over time. And now in kind of the Anzac context or thinking about foreign policy and defense, we're starting to have more conversations in this country about what is our place in the world and how at risk is it? thinking of whether we should join up to AUKUS. Our politicians are finally having a debate about that. Historically, New Zealand has not talked a lot about foreign policy in our politics, but seeing some greater external threats might cause us to pull together in some ways.
And hey, some interesting food for thought, fascinating article. It's going to be published, I understand, on the Maxim website by the end of the week. Thomas, thanks for taking the time to chat with us today.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.